Hi, my name's Phil. I like talking about politics, and this is the second in a short series to try and really explain, from my point of view, the major events that led up to where we are with the Brexit mess at the moment. The first part was on the lead up to the referendum. There's a link in the description below if you haven't seen that yet. This one is, well, from that point onwards. And first of all, of course, David Cameron had resigned. He hadn't just resigned as Prime Minister. He'd left Parliament altogether to move to France to rustle pigs. And the Conservative government, therefore, had to find a new leader. Now, Boris Johnson, who was a determined Remainer, quite a staunch Remainer, who at the last minute, relatively speaking, decided to turn Leaver in order to further his political ambitions, was one such candidate for that job. He'd reasoned that switching to Leave might help him win the support of the far right, because they knew that David Cameron was going to be quitting as leader at that Parliament. He'd basically said so. I always got the impression of David Cameron, I always describe him as not someone who wanted to be Prime Minister, but someone who wanted to have been Prime Minister. I think from the day he became Prime Minister, he was looking forward to the day he could leave. He never really seemed into it to me. But anyway, so Boris Johnson reasoned that, he thought, well, like everyone else, the Remain campaign would win. Because again, in his mind, you've got to remember, in his mind, he knows the EU is good for us. And he couldn't understand that other people wouldn't see that. So he'd think, right, get there. But by him campaigning for Leave, that would endear him to a solid block of the Conservative MPs and therefore put him in pole position to become Prime Minister after David Cameron. That was his plan. And okay, yes, this is speculation from my part in a way, but also people close to him have basically said the same thing. We've had everything other than he himself come out on television and say as much. But you could take that as speculation if you like. So on the 24th of June 2016, the results were announced. And the result was for Leave. That knocked his political ambitions for six pretty much. Because after this narrow victory, because you've got to remember, when it's a narrow victory, you can almost imagine, well, you switching to Leave may have swung that as well because you're influential. So he was now reviled within his own party. He may have had some support from the hard right, but he'd lost all of it from the rest of the party. And the rest of the party was what he needed as well. Theresa May was fairly quickly seen as the compromise candidate. Basically, when Boris Johnson, he was about to give a speech, for his pitch as leader, and then he was abandoned by close supporters at just, very shortly before, in fact. So that completely pulled the rug out from under him. So he basically had to withdraw from the leadership contest. So with Theresa May, she is a Remainer who now said she could deliver Brexit that would work for Britain. So in other words, she was chanting from the Brexiteer hymn sheet. So that found favour with that hard right. She balanced her cabinet such that there was an equal mix of Brexiteer and Remainer. She put three key Brexiteers in charge of negotiations. So David Davis became the Brexit Secretary, so he'd be in charge of the negotiations with the EU. Liam Fox became Minister for International Trade and Industry, and Boris Johnson became Foreign Secretary. So they'd be basically looking after negotiations with the rest of the world. But before they could get to work, Article 50 had to be triggered. There's a formal process for that which begins, of course, the expected 2-year process of withdrawal. Now, before that could happen, because the EU had said no negotiations until that's triggered, a case was brought to court in order to confirm that the government would have to consult Parliament before doing it. In other words, the Prime Minister couldn't just write a letter herself and send it off to the EU Council President. So the High Court judges confirmed that the legal situation was indeed Parliament has to be involved, but at which point the Brexit media went full blood, most notably the Daily Mail, roundly attacking the judges for simply saying what the law says, again using references to the Second World War. This paper that was calling for us to only have our decisions made by Parliament and by our own courts was now turning on those courts and would soon do the same with Parliament. So after debates in Parliament, Theresa May was able to write her letter and trigger Article 50. It was never going to be a big ask, if we're honest. There's a powerful Eurosceptic core within the government party and a Eurosceptic leader in charge of the main opposition party. And MPs in general really not sure what the implications for all this ill-advised referendum result were. In the following negotiations, David Davis basically took a tactic of just waiting for the EU to give in to all his demands. His strategy was to sit on a chair and stare. He didn't even turn up with any notes to meetings, which used to infuriate the EU negotiators. Liam Fox did little better. In 2 years, after the chief Brexiteers were all saying, oh yeah, you can knock up a trade deal in an afternoon, 2 years later, we basically have a small number of countries, which represents a small amount of our trade, that have signed up to agreements, not deals, but agreements. Boris Johnson simply kept bashing Theresa May at every opportunity, in both the paper and in interviews as well. Something that really should get ministers fired. Because that's the thing. If you don't toe the party line as a minister, you can't be a minister. But May turned out to be every bit as weak as Cameron. Labour, of course, under Jeremy Corbyn, adopted a position of getting fully behind the illegal referendum result. Remember, 80% of his parliamentary party were against him and tried to oust him as leader, but he was striking a chord with ordinary people who, again, just like it was believed the referendum result was, to a large extent, a protest result, so was support for Jeremy Corbyn. He was definitely not one of the political elite. So they kept him in office, definitely. In Labour, the leader is essentially chosen by party members. So the parliamentary party has a role in selecting leaders, but they can't get rid of one when they don't like it, unlike the Conservatives, for example. So basically, primary legislation needed to get the Brexit ball rolling was going to be passed through Parliament, no problem. And after months of saying that she wasn't going to call a general election, in April 2017, Theresa May did just that. Parliament had to vote on this, but of course Parliament did. Opposition are very happy to vote for new general elections. The reason she did it is she was seen as quite popular in the polls. She was faced with a leader of the opposition that was never able to land any telling blows on her, even though her party was getting up to all sorts of nonsense. And she also had a majority, but it wasn't big enough to enforce her will. There were a core of hardline Brexiteers that she knew were championing an outcome that did not exist in reality. And she wanted an outcome based on reality. She saw David Davis achieving nothing and the ERG steering towards a no deal. And an opposition led by someone she didn't want to engage with. So she very famously, throughout this entire process, wouldn't engage with the opposition. So she decided she needed more authority in Parliament and called the general election. Parliament went along with it, but it didn't quite go according to her plans. First of all, Jeremy Corbyn didn't drop a load of clangers, and he actually managed to stay on message pretty well. He did a good job. In contrast, Theresa May is surprisingly shy in public and didn't really come across well. She tried making it appear that she was speaking to crowds by getting a small group of people to crowd around her and zooming right in. But then there were also photos of them zoomed out, and you're just seeing it's basically a dozen people around her. She couldn't even chow down on our national dish without making a mess of it, so she fared quite poorly, and she actually lost what little majority she had, though she was still the leader of the largest party in Parliament. In Northern Ireland, the right-wing DUP gained even more seats than they had at the previous general election, which brought them to just the right number of MPs to prop up Theresa May's minority government that she wished to form. Okay, but now she's in an even worse position. She called the general election so she could have enough authority to face down the hard right of her party. That failed disastrously. In addition, the Brexiteers were now arguing against remaining in the single market or joining a customs union, things that they'd been quite happy to say we would do before, in order to get the support of the DUP, who would support her in budgets and votes of confidence. It's called a supply and confidence deal. So there's two things you need to be able to form a government. You don't have to be able to pass the legislation you want. That's not realistic as a minority government. You hopefully pass enough of it. What you need to be able to pass is a budget. And you need to... It's not like in America, if the budget doesn't get passed, you don't have the government on hold. Government's gone, get a new one. And also, they need to decide who's going to be the Prime Minister. So they would agree to vote for her in votes of confidence in her leadership and in the budgets in order to maintain the government. In return for which, she bribed them with £1 billion of public finances on Northern Irish projects which met with their approval. Not all of which has been paid out, of course, she's not that stupid, paid it out over time to make sure they stick to their deal. So Theresa May was basically now caught between the devil and the deep blue sea. To give the ERG what they say they wanted, the default position is a breach of the Good Friday Agreement. To give the ERG essentially what they want, but without screwing over Northern Ireland, would mean placing Northern Ireland in a bubble separate to the rest of the UK, and the DUP, as well as some Tory MPs, wouldn't accept that. So at this point, at this very moment, in late June 2017, a Brexit deal officially became impossible. All that there was left to do was to go through the pretense of negotiating a deal, knowing full well it'll go nowhere. Now, with David Davis's failure to get anything close to an agreement, he was just still there, sat on his hands without any notes, Theresa May stepped in to negotiate a withdrawal agreement to include a transitionary period, as it was crystal clear by now that a final settlement would never happen in time. But Northern Ireland pretty much laid the path. The only way to honour the Good Friday Agreement was for a customs union. May couldn't negotiate that with her reliance on parliamentary votes opposed to it, so they came up with the backstop. Now, the negotiators suggested a UK-wide backstop, which the EU accepted, but May knew that this would never get through Parliament, so suggested one just covering Northern Ireland. She'd have known that the DUP would reject it, but she may have believed, this is speculation, she may have believed that if her own party accepted it, or enough of them, and she'd get enough support from opposition MPs as well, that it would sneak through. Or perhaps she knew it was doomed all along and she was just running down the clock even back then. Now in June 2018, crack on a year, Parliament passed the European Union Withdrawal Act, but only after insisting on a meaningful vote on the final deal. This is something Theresa May had resisted quite strongly. She'd hoped to railroad a Brexit deal through. That completely evaporated. Parliament would have to approve the final deal, which would be nigh on impossible with the ERG and the DUP both voting against anything realistic and the opposition voting against her deal on principle. It was clear at this point she wouldn't be able to get a deal through. So in mid-July 2018, Theresa May had agreed the draft withdrawal teams with the EU and met her own cabinet in the Prime Minister's country retreat, Chequers. There the cabinet voted in favour of the deal, though David Davis resigned in protest over it, and there was a number of others that weren't happy, but they went along with it. And it also meant that Boris Johnson, so he didn't look a fool, or more of a fool, also had to resign after David Davis. So two ministers that the PM should have sacked for their failure to live up to the ministerial code now got to resign, making them look like the principled ones. Another act of prime ministerial naivety. Then in October 2018, because you think to yourself at this point, so it's time for Parliament to vote on this deal now, is it? No. Stringing it out, delaying it as long as possible. So in October 2018, basically people were looking at this and everyone was realising this deal ain't going to get through. And a protest was organised to call for a second referendum, dubbed the People's Vote. And it attracted 700,000 people. It became the second largest demonstration in UK history after the Stop the War protest 15 years earlier. In a quite pathetic attempt to counter this movement, a different protest was organised by UKIP. It was to show support for Brexit full steam ahead. As I say, UKIP organised it, and according to the Brexiteers, well, UKIP are the party of the people, and so surely they'd have no trouble matching and even beating the 700,000 people that are merely remoaners calling for another referendum. They managed to get 3,000 people. Now, that's not just pathetic on its own. They were even outnumbered on the day. There was another group, when they found out that UKIP were organising this protest, another group organised a counter-protest, not for another referendum, but just to protest against the protest. So a group to protest against UKIP's protest, and they managed to cobble together 15,000. So even on the day, UKIP were outnumbered 5-1 by something that was only protesting against their presence on the streets. The vote for Parliament to ratify the withdrawal agreement that had been approved by the other 27 members of the EU at this point was then set for December 2018. And that's where we got up to in terms of it being ready to be voted on by Parliament. In part 3, I'm going to talk about what happened then. Of course, that's much more recent. And from there to where we pretty much are now. So I hope you enjoyed the video. If you found it interesting, please click the like button, subscribe for further content, click the bell notification to be notified of further content. As I say, if you haven't seen part 1, then it should be in a link below. I'm also putting them in a playlist together as well. And until next time, I'll see you later.